If you have time. Natalie Garibian was in her bedroom packing her suitcases. She was 20 years old and she was both nervous and excited. The next day, she was traveling from her home in Florida to Paris, France, where she would study for a semester. She was almost finished packing when her father walked into the room. He held two small black and white photos in his hand. "When I was your age, I traveled too," he said in Armenian, his native language. "I came to the United States. On the way, I stopped in Syria and stayed with a cousin for a few weeks. She and her husband had 4 children, a son and 3 daughters. They're the family in these photos. I heard from a relative that the daughters might be living in Paris now. I know you'll be busy in Paris, but I hope at some point you'll have time to look for these girls. I'd like to know how they are, and I'd like them to meet you." Mr. Garibian turned the photos over and showed Natalie the names written on the back. "Of course, that was 30 years ago," he continued. "The girls are probably married and have different names. I'm sure they look very different, too. Maybe they don't even live in Paris. Still, I hope you have time to look for them." Natalie took the photos from her father and sighed. "If I have time, Papa," Natalie answered in Armenian. "If I have time." Natalie knew that she would have to study hard in Paris. She wanted to travel a little, too. How would she find time to look for the girls? She didn't know what they looked like, what their names were, or where they lived. Looking for them would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. What was her father thinking? Natalie put the photos at the bottom of her suitcase. She did not intend to spend her semester in Paris looking for the girls, grown women now, who had met her father 30 years ago. When Natalie arrived in Paris, she immediately began making the most of her experience. During the week, she went to classes, and on long weekends, she took train trips throughout Europe. The summer passed, and the fall passed. The days got shorter, darker, and colder. Natalie was homesick. She missed her family. She missed her mother's cooking, and she missed hearing her parents speak Armenian. She remembered seeing a small stone Armenian church on a street in Paris. She decided to go there for a church service, just to hear Armenian spoken again. When Natalie arrived at the church, she was surprised to see that it was crowded. She found a chair and sat down. A few minutes later, she saw a woman about 70 years old walking up and down the aisle on the other side of the church, looking for an empty chair. The woman was bent over and seemed to have trouble walking. Several people offered her their seats, but she shook her head, no, and kept walking in Natalie's direction. A few minutes later, she was standing next to Natalie. Natalie stood up and, in Armenian, offered the woman her seat. The woman sat down. Natalie looked around. The only seat left was at the end of the row, against the stone wall. So Natalie sat down there. All through the service, the woman kept turning her head and staring at her. When the service ended, the woman asked her in Armenian, "You're not from here, are you?" Natalie was dismayed. She had lived in the United States her whole life, but she had always spoken Armenian with her parents. She thought her Armenian was pretty good. She wondered if she spoke Armenian with an American accent. "No, I'm not from here," Natalie answered. "How did you know?" "I'm not from here either," the woman answered. "I'm visiting my daughters. But I've noticed that the young Armenians, the one who grow up here, don't speak Armenian. They all speak French. You speak Armenian. Good Armenian. So I knew you weren't from here. Where are you from?" "I'm from the United States." "From Florida," Natalie answered. Ah, I have relatives in Florida, the woman said. She began to say their names. Sarkis, Dikran, Ara. Ara? Natalie asked. Ara was Natalie's father's name. When did you last see Ara? 30 years ago in Syria, the woman answered. He stayed with my family for a while on his way to the United States. Such a nice young man. He was so kind to my children. Natalie began to cry. That's my father, she said. The woman began to cry too and raised her hands. Azdudzu Kordeza, she said. God's work. I've been looking for your father for 30 years. I knew you were something special. I knew it in your face. Natalie had wanted to hear Armenian because she missed her family. She thought they were all thousands of miles away. Not all of them were far away. One of them was sitting near her in a small stone church in Paris.